I'm so honored to be on the stage with these three incredible thinkers, and we're going to start by introducing them. Not that they need any introductions, but to my left, Tanya Talaga. Tanya is an Anishinaabe journalist and speaker who comes from the community of Fort Williams First Nation on the western shores of Lake Superior. Her mother was raised on Fort Williams traditional territory, as well as on Treaty 9. Her father was Polish-Canadian. For more than 20 years, she was a journalist at the Toronto Star, covering everything from health and education to Queen's Park. She's been nominated 6 times for the Michener Award in Public Service Journalism and been part of teams that have won national newspaper awards. She is also, of course, known for her 2 national bestsellers, Seven Fallen Feathers, and her second book, All Our Relations, Finding the Path Forward. In 2017 to 18, she was the Atkinson Fellow in Public Policy and the 2018 C.B. Massey Lecturer, and she runs Makwa Creative, a production company focused on amplifying Indigenous voices through documentary, film, and television. Welcome, Tanya. Yeah. Jesse Wente also does not need an introduction, but I am so happy he's here and going to read this, is a husband and father. We know he's an avid golfer and has an amazing doodle that he likes to post on Instagram, as well as an award-winning writer and speaker. Born and raised in Toronto, his family comes from Chicago and Ganabajing, Anishinaabeg, and he is an off-reserve member of the Serpent River First Nation. Jesse is known as being, for 2 decades, a journalist and columnist for Metro Morning on CBC, and was for a decade with the Toronto International Film Festival as a curator, including leading film programming at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. In 2018, Jesse was named the founding director of the Indigenous Screen Office, and in summer 2020, appointed chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. His first book, Unreconciled: Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance, is a national bestseller and was picked as one of the best books of 2021 by Chapters Indigo, Apple Books, and the Globe and Mail. Please welcome Jesse. Naheed Nenshi served as Calgary's mayor for 3 terms between 2010 and 2021. During his time and tenure, Calgary became one of the greatest cities in the world, named as the best city to live in the Western Hemisphere. His leadership saw unprecedented investment in quality of life, including transit, roads, recreation centers, libraries, including the beautiful Central Library. And his time as mayor also saw the city of Calgary through 4 years of state of emergency, including the floods in 2013 and the COVID-19 pandemic. He has become an international voice on urban issues with audiences across Canada and around the world, including the World Economic Forum in Davos. He was awarded the World Mayor Prize as the best mayor in the world in 2014. That is amazing. Prior to his election, Naheed served as Canada's first tenured professor of nonprofit management at the Bissett School of Business at Mount Royal University, and he was a consultant with McKinsey before that. He is a proud first-generation Canadian of Indian ancestry whose parents immigrated from Tanzania. His family and his Ismaili Muslim faith instilled in him the ethic of seva. I love that word. Service to the community, something he tries to live every day. Please welcome next. Thank you. So before we jump into questions, and we have about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up to you, I thought I would just give us a little overview of how we're going to approach this conversation, because it is a very, very big topic, as each topic has been today. I blame myself and Francesca for this. Over the past 2 days, we've obviously heard a lot about a country in flux and complex problems without clear solutions, whether it's in terms of immigration, economic reconciliation, and that really we are at an inflection point of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and the story we might wish to tell ourselves. So in this time of negotiating and renegotiating our own stories on multiple fronts, we're going to speak about it first domestically and then internationally, and maybe ultimately ask, what has the narrative been that we're contesting? And as I said, what is the one we want to tell? To begin, I'm going to throw this out to all of you, and maybe Tanya will start with yourself. The panel is called Shared National Narratives in a Fractured Time. Let's begin with the assumption. In 2023, do we have a shared narrative? And why are the stories we tell ourselves important, or the collective story we tell ourselves important?
Miigwech, it's good to see everyone. Thanks for coming to listen to us, and thanks for this forum. I was listening with intent yesterday too at the immigration forum. And there was many times I actually wanted to jump in and say something, and I'm going to sort of take a little bit of what I was thinking from then to today. When we ask ourselves, this is something that came up yesterday when we were talking about immigration, what is Canada? What is Canada? What do we see it as internationally and for people that are coming here? What is the experience to be living in this country? And what do we aspire for when we tell people to come here? We have different perspectives of what it means to be Canadian. I am a First Nations person, but I am also a Canadian. I have grown up in this country, but I am the product of the Indian Act, which is a racist, paternalistic piece of legislation that has been on the books in Canada since 1876. I am the product of residential schools. Not myself, but my family members went to schools. My family has been in the child welfare system as well. We come from the land. This is the Canada that I know, and it looks a little bit differently, I think, to most other people, except for the panelists we heard earlier today, and maybe to Jesse. So what is Canada, and where are we going with Canada? I think there are a lot of different ways we can answer what is a Canadian, who is on this land, and what are we going to be doing collectively as a future? How do we define it, and how do we define this internationally? I think you have a lot of different answers. I don't think there is one collective answer, because the narrative that we have spun internationally and to a large extent domestically is that we are a caring, wonderful society that has equal opportunity to education, equal opportunity to health care, is a lie.
Yeah. Thank you. Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, ditto. But then, to me, I wonder if what gets in the way of our shared narratives is nationalism. In that, you know, if we're here today on these lands, the shared narrative is probably the human experience of being here on these lands. And yet when you pile on notions of Canada or these sorts of things, then it becomes fractious. And so I just wonder if maybe if we sort of ground ourselves in like what it is to be human, then we can sort of find our shared narratives that exist beyond these sort of notions of nationalism or those sorts of identity issues. Then maybe that would be the shared. You know, I'm always struck, you know, I spent my life in the cultural sector here in Canada, and there's always been this sort of dialogue around what Canadian culture is, what being Canadian is. And I always suggest maybe look out the window. Because for our people, that was and is our culture. It's like the land. And I don't know how you could be anywhere on this place and not look out a window and go, yeah, that's it. Like, it's like, look where we are today. I mean, you folks get to have that every day. In Toronto, it can be somewhat, you know, you open the window, it's not more concrete. But so I don't know, I think that's always been the culture of this place, is it's very much in the land. I think if we stepped away from some of those other things that we layer on it, it would be easier to discern that we're not necessarily, the narratives that are different are the ones around nationalism and sort of human ideas as opposed to the lived experience.
I think we'll come back to that in terms of dismantling what you were calling maybe the lie or the constructs we've built around it, but thank you. Naheed?
Well, I don't know about all of you, but I feel like I could just listen to the three of these talk. You've got sort of three of the most brilliant people in the country, you know, and me for comic relief here, but thank you. Thank you all for taking your time to really get into, I hope, a deep conversation about community and about where we are today, because it matters. You know, one of our federal political leaders, who is very good at narrative, is very fond of saying that everything feels broken, that Canada feels broken. And if you listen to him very carefully, he rarely slips and says Canada is broken. He says Canada feels broken. Because you can argue against Canada is broken. You can talk about the progress we've made in so many ways. You can talk about the continuing project of Canada, moving from reconciliation to reconciliation, moving from diversity and pluralism and multiculturalism to anti-racism. You can talk about how the country has never been more economically prosperous than it is today. You can argue against Canada is broken. You can't argue against Canada feels broken. And this is really where people in my former profession have learned that the art of narrative, the art of storytelling, is incredibly important in a way to build power. It's also incredibly dangerous. And so what I often say is that politicians from across the political spectrum, but particularly on one side of the political spectrum, if you believe in such things, I'm not sure that I do. That's why I'm wearing my purple sneakers today. It's not just because I may have forgotten to pack dress shoes. It's because I wear purple every single day. And it's not because it brings out the color of my eyes, not just because it brings out the color of my eyes. It's because it's red and blue. So I wear purple every day to remind people that we are not defined by our tribes, but we're defined by our common humanity. And the point I was trying to make is that you see folks who may not agree with that sticking to these narratives that are designed to be divisive. It's not accidental, it's on purpose. But as my former premier in Alberta found out, once you open the closet and let the monsters out, you can't always control the monsters. So I think that our challenge as a community is to rebuild the narrative. And if I may, Devyani, I'll just give one quick example. So you may have heard that we're in the middle of a pandemic. You may have heard that it's over. It ain't over. It ain't over at all. In fact, we will almost certainly, in the month of December this year, have the largest number of deaths from COVID-19 in Canada since the beginning of the pandemic. We don't like to talk about it anymore, though. Politicians got nervous, they got scared because of all this division that was brought out. And so we've kind of gone to a world where, you know, in the words of that great Disney movie Encanto, we don't talk about COVID, no. But not talking about it means that there's a vacuum in the narrative. And that vacuum has been filled by a conversation that says we overreacted, we went too far, we infringed on people's, air quotes, freedoms, instead of the true narrative. The true narrative was in a very frightening time where the science wasn't there for us, where we didn't know what we were doing. We asked people to make relatively small personal sacrifices, and as a result saved hundreds of thousands of lives in this country, millions of lives around the world. We never talk about that anymore. And when you don't talk about it, when you don't build that narrative, when you're not engaging in that service and that seva to build community and empathy amongst one another, you create a vacuum. And there are many, many people who are very happy to fill that vacuum with a fractious, dangerous narrative. And let's be clear, for personal and political gain. There are some people who just want to see the world burn, but the people who are designing this are doing it for power.
Can we talk about one of these people? Sorry, I'm just going to lob it right back to you.
Please.
So last week, Daniel Smith talked about the dismantling of the Alberta health system and pulling out of the CPP and pausing investment into renewables. And I'm curious to...
It wasn't all in 1 week.
Not all in 1 week, over the summer. Let's give her that.
She does it a week at a time.
Fair enough, a week at a time, pretty quickly. In light of needing to not let that space be filled with increasing divisiveness and polarization, how do we stem this?
So Premier Smith's an interesting cat. I've known her for 30 years. We went to university together. I was a child prodigy. And there's a big debate in Alberta where she does not really have a majority of the people behind her. And the big debate is, does she just want to watch the world burn? Does she have a broader agenda that we're not really seeing? Or does she just not know what she's doing? And so what is interesting there is, and I won't give you my answer yet, but what's interesting there is the three examples you give. The one I'd like to focus in on is the healthcare. So in Alberta, we have one health authority, 250,000 employees. It's, I think, the largest single health authority in North America. And it doesn't work. Everyone agrees it doesn't work. It's too bureaucratic. It's my dealing as mayor with Alberta Health Services was the biggest nightmare of my last few years, especially through the pandemic. Everyone agrees it doesn't work. And so this week, the premier announced really radical changes to the system. And normally, people would go, okay, let's give this a go. But there were two problems. Number one is she didn't consult with anybody. She didn't talk to any doctors or nurses or people in the system. And number two is, nobody trusts her to do the right thing. And this is where you reap what you sow. So after sowing all this division for whatever reason, she's eroded that base of trust. So even the folks who want to see the world burn don't want to see their healthcare system burn. People are self-interested. People don't want to see their pensions burn. And because she's starting from a place of no trust, it's going to be very difficult for her to be successful in enacting reforms that probably are good reforms that we actually need to do. But when you don't have that base of trust, because you've spent your entire political career dividing rather than uniting, it's very hard to get stuff done. And we're seeing a lot of that now in the federal government as well, where the federal government saw themselves as big uniters. You know, Shannon Proudfoot in the Globe wrote the single most devastating line about this federal government, which is they like to be judged on who they are, not what they've done. It's a good line, right? Wish I had written it. But the challenge there is that they've lost the plot on the beautiful narrative that the Prime Minister used to be so good about making people feel good about themselves. And if we don't have that, it sounds trite to say it, but if we don't have it, then people feel bad about themselves. And folks want them to feel bad about themselves because that helps them. Sorry, I'm going on too much. You asked a political question.
And I would like, Jesse and Tanya, I would love you to jump in on this, because obviously you're talking about a narrative which was a very much the sunny ways that we've seen for the last 8 years, but we know that is not the narrative of all people. What do you think is going to fill this vacuum around divisiveness?
One of the challenges we have is that regardless of political orientation, 30 years of neoliberal policies have meant that the institutions and systems of settler colonial states are in collapse. Mm-hmm. So the diagnosis of them is correct. I do think, I don't want to say Canada's broken, because from our community's standpoint, it's never been healed. Mm-hmm. But I don't see that as a bug. I see that as this was always what was going to happen, because you can't have systems that require sustained growth be a thing. No cow can forever grow. They eventually die, right? And so it's the same with these sort of systems. So I think one of the challenges we're in is that I don't know where there is political leadership in the country to actually speak the real truth around what's happening and make the big investments in changing them. I think it'll continue to be in the margins in sort of political campaigns. It'll be little moves here or there to try to get elected. I mean, my bigger concern with some of the political movements is, and maybe what you're describing, is I don't quite know what the end goal is other than making sure nothing works, but I don't quite know what lies beyond that. I'd be curious to know what lies beyond that. But from a narrative standpoint, one of the issues is the institutions that are meant to tell us stories are also victim to this collapse. Mm. So the storytelling ecosystem, the information ecosystem that have been developed no longer function. They're being taken advantage of. And so it's just hard to actually know what is going on right now. And especially if you don't gather like this, where at least we can face each other and sort of know what's going on in this room. But beyond here, it's really hard right now. And the danger in that is if you can't have stable ground, how are we actually going to resolve issues if we don't know if we're standing on the same place? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so I think it's just the failure of that sort of information ecosystem, which I also think is an intentional failure, is a caused failure, leaves us in a really vulnerable spot for exactly what you're describing, and people exploiting it. To the earlier panel, which discussed around economic reconciliation, talked about entry point in education, I sadly think it's the same here. I don't think there's an overnight out for anyone in this room. It's more we need to invest in our children's children so that they can have a better understanding of what is happening, because I think we're caught. We're disoriented and we're sort of swirling in the vortex. I think the best hope was maybe find some solid ground for the kids so that as the vortex, whatever is going to happen and is happening right now sort of passes, they're in a position to sort of rebuild and because I think our generation is sort of, we're caught up. We're getting swirled away, and it's hard for us to keep the ground other than to focus on what can we prepare our kids to do with what's going to be left. You know, one thing I wish, and then I'll stop, I wish like 30 years ago or 20 years ago, someone had the bright idea of going, you know what we should do? We should spend a massive amount of money to turn our library system into the internet.
Huh.
And leave it as a public good that's like a library that you access the information. And it's like, instead of saying, let's make it a capitalist. Let's make accessing simple information something that you basically have to pay for with your data. Like, let's not do that, let's make a library. I wish we can't do that now, it's long gone. But if we had done that, we could have had a public internet that was like a place, like I know libraries aren't perfect, but they're sort of the last thing we got. And that would have been a great vision. But if we can move towards that, that would be better, yeah.
Getting back to the divisiveness too with Danielle Smith, I mean, when she was making changes when she first came in, she didn't discuss any of those changes with any of the chiefs in Alberta.
Except for one.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? And so Saskatchewan, there's the same problem. We've seen that problem again too in Ontario with the Greenbelt legislation, where none of the chiefs of Ontario were given a phone call to talk about ruining a part of the province that is ecologically sensitive. I mean, divisiveness can be of our own making, right? And politicians' own making and government's own making. We have an otherness in this country, and if we want to change that, we need to bring everyone together. And why I say that is important to me is that we are all treaty people, right? We, as First Nations people, we have treaties, and those are the laws of the land. Treaties built Canada. Without the treaties, you would have no railway, right? Things would be totally different. So if you look back at the fundamental nature of how we formed as a nation, treaties were present, our people were present. And I think to heal this country, to make it less broken, we have to go back to that and start actually taking us seriously.
On that note, you wrote an opinion piece for the Globe when Wab Kinew won the premiership of Manitoba, and you said it suggests the lighting of Anishinabe's eighth fire, which I think connects to this return to principles. Can you tell us more about what that means?
Yeah, I didn't say that lightly, actually,
That's not a
because
light thing to say.
I know. I was like, oh my gosh, should I say that? Should I say that? But there's a couple of reasons why I did. First, I did what I often do, and that's I consulted Elder Sam Hatchney-Penenscum. I gave him a Facebook message saying, are we seeing this? Can I say we're seeing the eighth fire? Is it coming? And we had a good discussion about that, and I won't go into all 7 fires and the prophecies, which actually starts out here on the East Coast. Both Jesse and I are Anishinaabe, and so our origin story actually starts with the East Coast. That's the first fire. And we moved, actually, goes through fires 2 and 3 and to 4, gets us to the Great Lakes area. And all around the Great Lakes, you will find our people. And we don't see borders, right? So you will find us in Minnesota. You'll find us in Ontario, all parts of Ontario, Michigan. Manitoba, yeah, lots of us in Manitoba. Anyway, so the 5th fire, I believe it was the 5th fire, that talked about the coming of the light-skinned people. And how when they came, they would wear 2 faces. One would be a face of friendliness and brotherhood, and one would be a mask of death, and one that we should be wary of. Needless to say, we know which mask was worn, and we know how we got to this place. The prophecies talked about the children going, of our children going and just being gone, and getting to a time when our elders in the 7th fire would be laying down, and the youth would be rising up, and they would be looking to those for help. But our elders weren't all there. And it was hard to get that education, again, of who we are as a people. And then there would be the lighting of the 8th fire, of how our youth are moving up the groundswell. And I would say that that's what you see now. You know, Jesse and I are kind of old hand at this point. We're long in the tooth. And it's the others that are coming up behind us that are taking this forward and are growing with our people. You see us in business. You see us in the arts, our books, music, politics, increasingly. So, Eighth Fire. WAB actually did a series for CBC TV on, it was called The Eighth Fire. And so that's also part of the reason why I wrote it like that. And so he represents a new beginning because Canada hasn't worked out very well for us over the last 150 years as First Nations people. And to see him as a premier of a province where so much has happened, the province of Manitoba, that is so inspiring. Against it all, right? There he is. That is good for all of Canada to break down divisiveness.
I love that image, and I loved that you wrote that in that opinion piece, and I'm so excited by his win. That is a very hopeful foundation in light of kind of obviously a lot of chaos that we've just described. Naheed, I'd like to know, how do you see a solid, hopeful path out of this, building on what Tanya's just said?
Well, I think that, first of all, that was amazing. Poor Wob, that's a lot of pressure.
I know.
A lot of pressure on a politician, but I think he'll be able to do it. And, you know, something you said, Tanya, really struck me, which is I wonder if our irreversible move towards reconciliation, or as my friend Casey Eagle Speaker calls it, reconciliation, might be the thread or the foundation for rebuilding a lot of the work we're talking about. Because I'm asked this question, Devyani, all the time, because I'm an optimist by nature.
I know.
But I always talk about the multiple crises that are facing our society right now. I think there are 6 multiple crises: public health, mental health and addiction, economic justice, environmental crisis, equity, and then, you know, the world is at the brink of nuclear war all the time these days, it seems. So there's 6 of them, any one of which could destroy our civilization. But my optimistic nature comes from the fact that precisely because we're dealing with all of these simultaneously, and particularly because the pandemic has upended our views on how society works, on the nature of work and school and how we communicate with one another, that I think, and this is where Jesse is going to lead us, I think, in a big way, because I think we live in a moment of unprecedented creativity. Something that no one alive today has seen, except maybe after the Second World War, maybe for a few months in 1989. But it's a moment where we don't know what the future society is going to look like. I call it a wet clay moment. So a moment where we get to mold the future. The thing about wet clay, though, right? It hardens. And once it hardens, you can't reshape it without breaking it. So I think as exhausted as we are, as much as we want to just go back to our families and our lives, and we want to go back to normal, whatever that is. We want this to be over, whatever this is. We can't give up the fight now. This is precisely the moment where we have to be active, and we have to use our voices and our minds to be able to make real change. So I don't know what that future looks like. I don't know what the clay should be molded into. But I've been trying to think for the last year or two since I've been out of politics about what the path to get there is. And I think it's paved with, first of all, seva. So seva is a Sanskrit word. It means selfless service. And it's common to all South Asian languages. And if you live in Calgary, it's common to you because I've been talking about it for 15 years. But I think the idea of finding ways in which we can give seva in the community is important. I have a program that I launched years ago that I need to relaunch now that I'm retired called 3 Things for Canada. And all it is encouraging every citizen every year to do at least 3 acts of community service, whether it's shoveling your neighbor's walk or joining the board of a nonprofit organization. I think through that service we find number 2, which is empathy. Empathy is really hard right now. It's really hard right now because those people are crazy. They don't listen to reason. They are so down their own echo chamber. They're so stuck in their own ideology. We cannot bring them back into the community. Now, when I said that, be honest with yourself. Who did you picture in your mind? I can tell you who I pictured. I'm not shy about it. I pictured the people on the streets of Ottawa last winter. Other people would have pictured a drag queen indoctrinating a child by reading to them at a library. And that's precisely the problem, is that we've lost that need for empathy because it's so hard right now. But I think finding that empathy through service is how we recraft the narratives. It's not me telling a story or Jesse funding, a cornerstone arts organization to tell the story of Indigenous Canada. It is that. Please keep doing that. But it's also about all of us together with our neighbors crafting the narrative, which is the truth, that dealing with these incredibly difficult problems, there's nowhere in the world I'd rather be doing that than in this country. And so how do we get to that place? We're far from perfect, but how do we get there?
Why nowhere in the world? Why here?
Because we can have the conversation. Because people who look like us, if I can be this blunt about it, can have the conversation with people who look like most of you. In this place, you can't always do that. There's not a lot of countries where a guy who looks like me can be the mayor of a city that at the time was 25% people of color, 40% now, by the way, just 12 years later. But, where a Muslim can be sitting on a stage having a conversation about cultural values, look, there's not a lot of places in the world you can do that. And so while we've got a long way to go, I strongly believe that our commitment to equity, that our commitment to the environment, that our commitment to justice, which is deep-seated in Canada, we've gotten a lot of things wrong, and nowhere have we gotten it more wrong than with Indigenous peoples. But I think the basic values and commitment, I don't think I'm being trite, and I don't think I'm being naive in saying that's something we can build on that not everyone has. And that's why I'd rather do it here. Look, if I was talking the way I'm talking where my parents came from in Tanzania, well, I wouldn't be talking because I'd have been in jail a long time ago. So let's use this opportunity to be able to move forward, I think.
On that note, although you did say, keep doing the work, Jesse is the chair of the Canada Council, which is a $500 million fund that does disseminate down to fund most of our cultural institutions, this one I'm assuming as well. What is the role of culture in this rebuilding process, and how are you using your position to influence that?
I mean, obviously, I think from my life's work that I think stories and culture are sort of central to how we understand the world, how we communicate with one another, how we build societies, and all of those sorts of things. So, I mean, one of the reasons storytelling, and particularly getting the storytelling apparatus to people who don't historically have access to it in these places, is because I think that is how we can envision a new future, and then once we can envision it, then you can build it. And I think, Canada is a very young country. It is almost an infant. I know it's been around for a couple hundred years, but, Anishinaabe is 13,000 years old. So in comparison, it's quite different. And so it's funny, we're in this moment, but I see it as quite a natural thing for Canada to find itself in this moment. It's sort of like a tween. So, and if you all remember, when you're 11 or 12, you're really trying to figure out who you are. And I think Canada, much like a toddler, told a very fanciful story about the world to itself for a long time, and that's how it understood. And then sort of it left the house a little bit and went out into the world and went, oh, not exactly what I imagined. And so now it's sort of doing that tween work of well, who am I? And I think that stories is how we're going to help Canada get there, and stories from a variety of people who were not necessarily part of the national story before, and that can ultimately lead to sovereignty and things we want. In terms of what the Canada Council's doing, one of the struggles with the Canada Council, it's a crown corporation, so it's as colonial structure as you can get. It was founded after the Massey Commission, which was a deeply colonial sort of process that disregarded Indigenous culture entirely and wanted to eliminate it through the dissemination of European art forms performed in Canada. That was, fundamentally what its mission was. And so when Canada Council was founded, Indigenous artists were ineligible unless they were performing a European art form, so it was a tool of assimilation. Similarly to, residential schools, not quite as violent, but the same sort of idea. And Indigenous arts were completely ineligible. They were crafts or primitive. They weren't eligible. So obviously now we have an Indigenous funding program, But beyond that, like if you really want to know what I'm trying to do.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to do is reverse the centralization that occurred in the cultural sector over the last 30 years. So as you folks here have probably noticed, like there used to be, I'll use a totally different institution as an example, which I'm going to pick on them, but whatever. So the National Film Board used to, when I was a kid, in virtually like every major city in Toronto, like you could go to a movie theater that was run by the National Film Board. There was one right up the street from the CBC for like most of my childhood. They closed all those like 20 years ago. They shuttered them. They're all gone. And so now the NFB, they have what they call regional studios, but you as the public can't see them. Like they're not visible to you, right? You don't know, and the movies are produced and they show on TV maybe they get a theatrical, mostly they live on the NFB website. And so like you have this big cultural institution that gets $100 and whatever million annually from Canadians, and it's not really visible. Like I hesitate to ask, like, how many people here have recently seen an NFB production? Like, what? And so with I mean, in this room, there's probably going to be, they stream, no, I know they stream, but like,
You gotta go there.
The streaming environment, like that's, we call that in our industry discoverability. It's a real challenge, right? Because unless you know it's there, you don't naturally find it in the same way you do when I was a kid, when big movie posters, and there were only 7 channels anyway, so you had to zero in. And it was the same with Canada Council. Canada Council used to have like officers all across the country in the community that would meet with organizations and do all this stuff. And in over 30 years, because of lack of investment from the federal government and all this, and which is across the whole sector, these things shrank and they consolidated to where the Canada Council only exists in Ottawa, but it funds all of these things all over the country. But if you're sitting here, you probably have no idea what the hell the Canada Council funds, other than maybe this place, right? And some of the work that's done here. So my goal is to reverse that and to try to get the Canada Council back out so that it's tangible for human beings, that they can understand it. So we're partnering with local arts funders where we actually basically pay them to have a Canada Council employee there that helps the community access our programs. We're targeting the North. It was the first place we're doing this because we've underserved the North for the absolute entirety of the history of the organization. And yet the North produces some of the most recognizable art and culture in this entire country, right? If you go to Germany, they're gonna know Inuit sculpture more than they are gonna know a lot of other, like the whatever popular band like you may want from Canada. So we're looking at places like Alberta where there's also been historic lack or some disparities. Trying to do that, it's a big, Canada Council, as you mentioned, it's $500 million a year, it's 270 employees, it's unionized, I'm not gonna get it all done by the time my mandate is over, but when I took it, my style of leadership or the consultation I did with my elders when I took the position was, when you're on a journey and you're on a path, to change by 1 degree, for a long time, seems like you're doing the exact same thing, right? You've just shifted 1 degree and you're parallel walking, it seems like you're on the same path. But over time, you will end up in an entirely different place by shifting just 1 degree. And so as a leader, as First Nations leader, first chair of a federal crown who's First Nations, is it realistic to think I'm gonna be able to turn the ship to the opposite direction? It is unrealistic that I'm going to be able to do that. Can I shift it 1 degree? Yes. And if I can shift it to 1 degree, we will end up in a different spot. And I'm hoping that by shifting it 1 degree, it'll make it easier for my successor to shift it another degree. And so that we can eventually end up in an entirely different place, but it won't happen overnight. That would be the goal, is to make the Canada Council an organization that more Canadians are familiar with, that is present in your community, that is doing things, that builds a sense of trust. Again, I would advise this to any national organization, is that you be present. We joke, you probably remember this, like paving roads and like, but we sort of actually need a big movement of that in Canada because we don't trust our institutions, and the institutions don't work for regular people in their lives. So like paving the road outside of their house is a way for us to remember that like some of this can work when we behave like a community, when we go, yes, you being healthy is me being healthy, which is what COVID should have taught us, right? Is that my neighbor has a direct impact. Their health has a direct impact on mine. So it's best if we're all healthy. It's best if all our roads are paved. It's best if, when it comes to culture, you know, I took a tour with Steve before, and we were commenting, like, Charlottetown is not a big, huge city, but it has this remarkable facility. This is such a blessing and such a privilege to have something like this. My community, like Serpent River, we couldn't dream anything like this. And in small communities all across this country, same size as Charlottetown, they dream of a venue like this. And if we could invest in these, this would create so much. Like if I'm a kid and I come to here and I'm PI, suddenly a whole world of what I could make opens up. We're advancing redistribution at the Canada Council. That is what is going to happen. We're going to redistribute. It means large organizations might see less. They get the majority of the funding now, and most of them have received the majority of funding for the entirety of the history of the Canada Council. So we have to shift away. Here's the challenge, though, is if we fund 1 million small things, do we create a massive cultural movement?
I'm a bit more institutionalist about all of this, but I come at it in kind of a different way. So when I was a professor in the field of nonprofit management, the thing that I really focused on was actually how to get nonprofits to go away, which sounds like a funny thing to say. But in the sector, unlike in the private sector where you can go bankrupt, it's very rare for a nonprofit organization to go bankrupt. You know, you'll convert the executive director to a volunteer position, you'll push hard to try and get the next grant, and you'll just keep going. And, you know, in the private sector, Schumpeter talks about creative destruction. And so I was always talking about how do you figure out ways in the nonprofit sector to be creative and be able to move forward and change when every incentive is to stay with inertia in the same place you are. So on the one hand, I really agree that you got to move the 1 degree to 2 degrees or 3 degrees. You're not going to move it to 90 degrees. But you are able to make that change slowly. In the arts and culture sector, it's hard. There's a shocking thing, Jesse, you'll appreciate this, which is all of the artists are saying, all the big arts organizations are saying, wow, the audiences didn't come back when we reopened after the pandemic, right? What's happened? How do we reach out to them? But the secret, and I apologize because this is very crude, the secret thing that they will not admit to themselves is because their audiences were so old that many of them died during the pandemic. And they won't admit it to themselves, right? Because they hadn't been doing the work to be able to bring younger folks and newer folks into the concert halls and into the theaters. So you got to figure that out.
I like your idea of bringing this out to all of our different communities. You know, I can speak more from the perspective of where my communities are. We don't have anything like this. We don't have anything like this at all. If you've been to Thunder Bay, we have the community hall in Thunder Bay, you know, which is a great space. But go out to Mishkigaugamang, which is at the top of the 599, Highway 599, the last provincially serviced road in Ontario, the most northern part. Go out to Poplar Hill First Nation. Go to Pikangikum. Are you going to find any space like this? No. Are you going to find functioning water? Are you going to find an infrastructure, roads that you can drive on that you don't lose, you know, your muffler or half your truck? Are you going to find doctors? You know, but the arts has a role because so many of our people, we are artists. And we get grants. I know a lot of my friends live on Ontario Arts Council grants from Toronto, the ISO. And I just have to say, too, that Jesse does have a track record with this. He set up the Indigenous Screen Office, and it is an incredible force. And you can see the narrative of Canada changing because you're seeing more of our stories, more of our films, more of our podcasts. And that's because of the work that he's doing to decentralize and to change and move that power structure.
Me and like several hundred other people.
True, but you've been at the forefront of that, especially at the ISO. I know he doesn't like it when I say this, but it's true. You know, and we need to do that in order to actually hear the true voices of who we are as a people.
Exactly.
Right? And to get the stories out, too, of the fact of our communities have no water, you know, and why it is that we have girls taking their lives when they're 11 years old in our communities.
And I mean, we could go on narrative and culture, and I'm very conscious that this topic is huge. I think that is the key way around dissemination, and obviously we're seeing the story shift, and pushback has always been there. I want to bring back one question that brings Naheed in and all of us before we open it up to you, which is on the international front. So our stories are changing internally. We are potentially in chaos with divisiveness, but also with hope, like Wobb's win, and potentially a new moment. What are we actually selling of ourselves outside? You were just talking about Inuit art versus independent cinema. Naheed, you're on the world stage. Yesterday we talked in immigration about selling ourselves as this pluralistic place where you can make it when we're seeing as many immigrants wanting to return once they get here. So what is that external story going forward?
I think that Jesse's analogy about us growing up is really an apt one, which is that for a long time we've had, and we heard it yesterday, that slogan, "The world needs more Canada." I happen to believe that's true. I happen to believe the world would be well served by a little more Canada. But we actually have to live our story as well. And so to me, probably the single most important thing going on in Canada that nobody is talking about is what came up in the panel yesterday. The fact that research done by the Institute of Canadian Citizenship shows that a shocking number of newcomers to Canada are not taking out their citizenship, and a shocking number are talking about leaving. Here's the thing. The immigrant narrative, you've all heard it because it's true. People come here and they're shocked by the winter. Then they go, but it's okay. I can live with this weather. Ella means smiling, going, yeah, welcome to my family. Because of everything else that's here. And so, you know, one of the most eye-opening moments for me in the last few years, and I tell this story all the time, is in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd. This was a tough time for me because people were coming to the streets, you know, talking about their anger and their difficulty and the fact that they didn't fit in and they didn't have a voice. And it was hard for me because I'm like, well, I'm the mayor and I look like this. Things are working, right? And so we had these public hearings where we invited every Calgarian to come and tell their story of racism. And most of the people on my council were shocked by what they heard. I was not at all shocked. And two of my fellow council members were not at all shocked. You can imagine what tied us together. But then I asked myself, well, why am I not shocked? Because the stories this 21-year-old black kid tells about when he wants to go out with his friends on a Saturday night are exactly the same stories that my 21-year-old black best friend told when we were 21, and I'm old now. So why haven't these things changed? So I had this conversation with these kids, grade 12 students at Western Canada High School's public school in downtown Calgary. And what I gleaned from that conversation was that for people of color here in Canada, we have made a deal that we never talk about, but we all live it. We made a deal with the community. And the deal is we'll put up with it. You know, we will put up with know where are you really from. We'll put up with how do you pronounce that? We'll put up with, but you speak English so well. We'll put up with, how did she get that job, right? We'll put up with all of it because in return, we have the wonderful opportunities of living here, living in a place of limitless potential, especially for our kids. And what these young people were saying was, I don't, that's not my deal. I didn't make that deal. And I want to be respected and accepted for who I am, not to be happy with what I can get by putting up with everything else. And so to circle back to your question, we haven't figured that out in ourselves. So we have to figure out who we are, imperfect and flawed as we are, and what we stand for, and the fact that a guy who looks like this can be the mayor, and a guy who looks like that can be the head of the most important cultural institution, and a woman who looks like that can be one of the most influential voices in public policy in the country. That's good. But we have to be able to understand that story ourselves before we sell it on the world stage. And I think that the current federal government actually gets too much flack for what's going on right now with India and what's going on right now with China and other parts of the world. I think the reason they get too much flack is because there's still a narrative that says we should just be the good guys. Everyone should love us because we're nice. And when we actually stand up for ourselves, as inexpertly and poorly as the federal government may or may not be doing it, we get this pushback. And so I think to be able to tell the story internationally, we got to live the story here. And the most important part of living that story, and I'll wrap this thought here, is what we heard yesterday. I call the Canadian immigration system the greatest bait and switch system in the world. Right? We sell people on something. We tell them you can come here if you have education, if you have this profession, if you speak English or French, come. And then when they come, we say, well, you can't work in your profession. And, you know, people often ask themselves, and I heard this on the panel yesterday, well, why not? We need engineers, we need nurses. Why can't we just fix this? It should be easy to fix, right? And it's not Charles Tupper's fault. That's a callback to yesterday, right? It's actually designed that way. The system only works, the healthcare system only works when you have a whole bunch of extremely underpaid frontline workers working as personal support workers. And hey, if you can get personal support workers who are actually trained as nurses but still pay them minimum wage, yeah, man, you know, you're gonna get great care. It was designed like that. And so for us to live the story we tell in the world, we gotta live the story here.